Okay, so we're going to look here in this video at what happens when we have to decide between multiple things. So we've already looked at if and else statements where we're making a decision based on one condition or multiple conditions kind of nested together in a single if statement using like the ands or the ors. Well, another thing we can do is have kind of like a three-way if statement or 4 or 5. We can add multiple ifs like kind of nested together. Okay, and so one way we could approach this is we can just, well, first of all, let's come back to this. So we have a simulation here where we're checking to see if this button is pressed and turn that LED on. Now let's say that we also want to check to see if this button is pressed to use it to turn the other LED on. So one thing and then if this one's not pressed, we want this one to be, so if this one's pressed, we want the other LED to be off. So we want to kind of talk about. So one thing we can do is we can have two separate if statements here. And for this case, this will actually work. There may be circumstances where this might not be a solution for what we want, but we can just have this whole separate if like this, right? And this will do what we want. So now the two buttons work, but we can also nest these if statements together. And so instead of doing this, we can do an else if. And so there's like a three-way, like multiple branches off the single if statement. So before we have our else case, we'll go ahead and add an if else. So now you'll notice that the if doesn't have a condition, but when we have an if else, we do have a condition. And so we can check here to see if digital read on pin 8 is equal to low. And we're only checking this, you can see this only gets checked if this one wasn't true. Okay, and then in that case we have digital 3 going to low, but now we'll have digital 2, pin 2 going to high. Okay, and then the case where none of them is pressed, they'll both be off. And then in this case where the first one's pressed, we'll make sure to turn pin 2 to low as well. And so what's going to happen is each time through the loop, we're going to come to this statement here. We're going to check to see if the first button is pressed. If it's not, we're going to then jump down to here where we check to see if the second button is pressed. If it's not, we're going to jump down to here and do this else case. Okay? If this case is true, then we turn this LED on and this one off, and then we exit the if statement down here. If this one's false, we go to here and check this one. If it's true, we carry out these two lines of code, then we exit the if statement down here. And then the last case, we'll do this before exiting the if statement. Okay, now we run this. There is, oh, it's a dumb typo. Okay, it's not if else, it's else if. There we go. That was a silly one. Okay, so now we can check them. There we go. There we go, works as expected. Okay, so this is an else if statement, and you can see that it's used to decide between multiple things. Next, we'll go ahead and look at kind of using a button to keeping track about the amount of times a button has been pressed. Okay, so the last thing we're going to do here, as I said, is looking at kind of keeping track of the number of times a button's been pressed. And so what we're going to do now is we're going to switch between pressing the button to turn on the first one, pressing the button to turn on the second one, pressing it to turn on both, and then pressing it again to turn them all off. So there'll be 4 circumstances. And so what we'll need is we'll need some kind of counter to keep track of the amount of times that the button has been pressed. Okay, and so we'll say, you know, if the counter is equal to 0, then we will turn on the first LED, and then we'll say else if it's equal to 1, we'll turn on the second LED. Else if it's equal to 2, we'll turn them both on, or maybe we'll have them blink in that case. And then we'll do the else case. And so here we don't have a condition, we just have the else. We're assuming if it's not 0, 1, or 2, then it's 3. In that else case, we will say maybe like turn them both off. Okay, so I'll go ahead and type these in real quick, and then we'll start back the recording. Okay, so now I've got our 4 cases. We have if the counter is equal to 0, we've got the first one on and the second one off. If the counter is equal to 1, then we go to low versus high. So it's going to check this. If this one's false, it jumps down to here. If it's true, it executes this. If it's false, it jumps down to here. If this is true, then this gets executed. If it's false, it jumps down to here. Then after one of these gets picked and executed, it jumps down to the end of the if statement and continues with the loop. Okay, so now we have something that happens based on what the counter says. We run this, and we'll see that the counter's at 0. We've got to tell it it's an integer. Okay. And so we see we have the first one on. Now the counter never changes, and so nothing happens there. And so now we want to keep track of the number of times the button has been pressed. And so we'll actually do that here at the end. And we'll say, okay, int button reading is equal to digital read, and we'll read pin 9. Okay, and for the purposes of these videos, I really want to make sure we're not confusing the variables themselves with the objects themselves, and that's why I don't use variables here. But generally, anytime you're using a number, especially for a pin, you should be using a variable. And at some point I'll switch over to using those exclusively. But again, for purposes of just understanding how the microcontroller is working and making sure we're knowing what's going into these functions, I'm not using variables for the time being. So anyway, so we read the button, and then we're going to check to see if that button has been read. So if button reading is equal to low, then we'll have some kind of thing here. Okay? When we talked about conditions previously, one of the major bugs that comes up a lot is if we accidentally put the equal sign here, because what happens there is we're actually changing the value of button reading instead of comparing it. So always with comparisons, we want the double equal sign. Okay? So if the button reading is low, what we will do is we will take our counter and we will add to it 1. And so that counts up to the next one. And let's also just add like a serial dot print ln of our counter so we can see what value it's currently at. Alright, and then I'm going to add a short delay here of 50. Actually, we'll wait on the delay. Okay, so we're going to run this code. Actually, I'll add the delay for now. We'll come back to it later. So say delay 50. Okay, so I start the simulation. And we can see here the light's on. Bring up the serial monitor. And, oh, need to initialize it. Dot begin 9600. Okay. So we can see it's reading 0. We press the button. Now it's at 2. It skipped past 1, went to 2. We press again. Now we're at 4 and they're off. Oh, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10, 12. So every time we press it, it keeps going up, right? So we don't want it to keep going up. We want it to stop when it gets to 3, right? 0, 1, 2, and 3. And so we need a way to reset the value of the counter. And so what we're going to do is we're going to use, this is where we use that modulus operator we just learned about. So we're going to say counter percent equals 4. And what's that going to do is it's going to divide it by 4 and get the remainder. And so if the counter is equal to 4, 4 divided by 4 is 1. Remainder of 0, and so then that's going to reset the counter to 0 because this performs the modulus operation and then reassigns it to the value of counter. If it's 5, it will never get to 5, but if it was 5, 5 divided by 4 is 1, or it has is 1 with a remainder of 1. 6 divided by 4 is 1 with a remainder of 2, so 0, 1, 2, etc. Okay, and so we run this one now, and we'll see that it's going to keep just counting up. Okay, and you're also noticing that there's another issue going on here where it's skipping numbers. Okay, and what happens is there's two kind of problems that we run into. When we press the button, we only want it to read one time that it was pressed. Okay, but this loop executes pretty fast. So we even have a small delay here, but it executes pretty fast. And so we press that button, And if we're pressing the button still when the loop comes back around, then it's going to just say that we had pressed the button again, even though we hadn't just let go of that previous time. And so by adding some more delay here, we can help with that. And so we start the simulation. Let's see if this fixes it. Yep, and looks like we're good here. And we skipped it a little bit there, you know, if you're timing it wrong. Okay, and now we can look at also maybe making this longer, but the trade-off is if you make this to be too long, like 1 second, then every loop takes a second, and so we only check to see if the button's pressed every second. And so I can be pressing this button, and it's not going to read it as a press. So I clicked it a bunch of times, and it's only getting some of them, right? And so I clicked it, didn't check, clicked it. So I have to be clicking it when it gets to that loop, part of the loop. And so if this delay is too long, that can make it hard to read. Okay, and so there's going to be kind of some little sweet spot here, maybe around like 300, that will allow us to make sure we're getting the clicks. See, we missed one there, but we're not getting double ones. So 300, maybe 100 or 200, you can mess around with it and see. Okay, but now we have a way of keeping track of the number of times we've pressed it, right? We're counting up every time we press it. We reset that value to 0 once it gets to 4, okay? And we have some kind of delay to allow for the fact that the button might be getting pressed, you know, multiple times. Okay, and there's actually a way around this called using an interrupt, which for the extra credit part of this assignment, I'll show you how to do that as an optional extra credit thing. Okay, so anyway, here's how we can both use the IfElse statements as well as keep track of the number of times something has been pressed. This is going to be really important for the next project that we do.